Wow, thank you for that introduction, and it really is my pleasure to be here today. I've gotten to listen to so many of these great egg seminar series, so it's an honor to be a speaker at one of these. And so, thank you, Alyssa, and thanks for all your work on this particular seminar series. So, I was just going to start with a brief background on myself, but Alyssa already covered it, so we'll jam through that. I'm going to share 6 lessons I learned while I was at the Energy Commission. I started as 10, and I narrowed it down this morning to 6. And 3 ways that I'm committed to helping the Commission now that I'm back at UC Davis and I'm excited to be here. So we're going to go on a journey, 18 months. What did I do? Well, okay, I do have this slide, so I'll just tell you, I bleed blue and gold. I actually bleed black and gold as well. I'm a Pittsburgh Steelers fan. But I bleed blue and gold because I got all my degrees from UC. My 2 kids go to UC, one at UC San Diego, one at Santa Cruz, 2 older kids. Anyways, so I'm definitely a UC guy, as you know, and I'm really thrilled to be here working at the Institute and then also supporting the campus's Grand Challenges program, one of which is climate solutions, right? And that's really applicable to kind of what we're working on here. And climate obviously cuts across food, it cuts across community engagement, it cuts across health, which are the other 3 grand challenges, so it really kind of dovetails nicely. This is a picture. I did get to do an international trip, and I got to go visit. This is in Aberdeen, in Scotland, where we visited offshore wind installations there. And I'll talk a little bit about offshore wind during this next section. But first, I'm going to talk about this gentleman right here. This is Siva Gunda, and we didn't have the energy graduate group back then, but he was, we launched what is now the Energy and Efficiency Institute, 2006. 2007 we really got started. I was the first hire. And one of the first students I hired was actually, I think Kurt Kornbluth was probably the first, but Siva was probably the 3rd or 4th student that I hired. And he went on to get an internship at PG&E working on emerging technologies, and then he was doing such a great job, maybe not finishing his PhD in mechanical engineering because I distracted him, because I got him working on cool research projects, so much so that I hired him as a project manager, and then he became director of research for our program. Then about 7 years ago, he left to go to the Energy Commission and work in their Energy Assessments Division, and he worked his way up. I think there's some noise. If you want to mute, there we go. And so he worked his way up, and now and he became a commissioner, and is now a vice chair. And so I had the great fortune of kind of joining his office as a senior advisor and then chief of staff for his team. And there's 5 commissioners. There's this thing called the Bagley-Keene Act, which kind of makes it difficult for it. What you want to do is avoid having backroom deals, right? So they want to make sure that any kind of discussion of a particular topic or issue that the regulatory agency is voting on is that it's done in public, right? And so, so they try to divide the work and have lead commissioners on particular topics, and then those commissioners will work on a particular topic, work with the staff to try to come up with a proposed ruling. That goes to a public business meeting, which happens 1 to 2 times a month. And at that point, all 5 commissioners can weigh in and vote on a particular topic. And so that avoids that backroom dealing. So this is kind of a rule that affects all agencies in the state, but certainly for the Energy Commission. And since there's 5 energy commissioners, you can't have more than a majority of people working on a particular issue. So they typically assign 1 lead commissioner to a topic and then a sub-lead. And so typically in the Energy Commission, the chair is involved in every topic. And then there's one of the other 4 commissioners will lead on it. So during my time supporting Siva, so by the way, I was really fortunate to get the blessing and support of UC Davis leadership and Alyssa and Kelly Kissick to kind of let me go on this loan to the Energy Commission. And I'm thrilled to be able to share some of the lessons I learned during that time. My hope is that I can leverage this experience, and hopefully it will inspire you and all of us to kind of work on really these challenging issues that we're facing. So anyway, I got a chance to negotiate this 16-month participation here, and he's got a lot on his plate. He has a lot on his plate. As a commissioner, he took on a lot, or was assigned a lot. First and foremost was reliability and emergency planning. He also has the SB 100, which is the decarbonizing electricity, the long-term planning. So how do you balance long-term planning while making sure you kind of maintain reliability? But this particular year, he was in charge of leading the Integrated Energy Policy Report, which it comes out every year. Included in that is an energy forecast, which the Energy Assessments Division kind of works on. Remember, that's the division he came from. And it's actually each commissioner is assigned a division to kind of oversee, and so that's the division that he has. But he was also tasked to work on certainly equity and making sure that equity was integrated throughout kind of the whole planning process. Again, reliability and long-term planning. Transition the gas system. We want to decarbonize the gas system. That involves decommissioning some of the natural gas system as we transition to all electric. Offshore wind planning, getting into that. That's why we got to go on that trip, which was definitely formative. Understanding load flexibility goals. Again, this ties into with reliability. OTC stands for once through cooling power plants, extending the life of those, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Regionalization is this effort to try to figure out how do we work together collectively with other states and other balancing authorities to share resources and import and export electricity and resource adequacy to support each other through emergencies. And the one at the end of last year was on oil refineries and profit margins and making sure that there's more transparency as we go through this transition, this great implementation where we're changing our fuel strategy. There is a risk for market manipulation. We've seen market manipulation in the past in California, and so we want to make sure we avoid that. So that's like a lot of work that we did, and I'll show you also probably the most intense time I spent was over Labor Day weekend. Not this year, but last year in 2022. It was an extended heat wave, you may recall this, and we came very close to going through rolling blackouts. And that was probably the most stressful time, but maybe the second most stressful time was my first month getting there. I thought I knew about energy. I thought I knew about how certainly energy efficiency works, the demand side of the energy equation. I thought I knew all the TLAs. Everybody knows what a TLA is? You've heard me talk about it? Three-letter acronym, right? So there's they have 4-letter acronyms there. They have 5-letter, they have 6, they've got them all. And it was kind of interesting. I came home after my first, every night during my first week, and I was decompressing. This is at 8 o'clock because we were working pretty long hours. And I'm like, I feel like I don't know what I'm doing. And I've been here at UC Davis, working here for 15 years. And, I knew where everything was. I knew all the acronyms. I knew if I had a question, I knew who to ask. If I needed something, I knew where to go. This was totally foreign to me. It's a totally new place, which, again, 15 years I've been in the same place, so it's like a new thing. But then it was humbling to realize I do not know what's going on and how this place works. How how policy is created, how the Energy Commission works, how the energy system really works, and how complicated it is. And so it was very tiring, very draining, especially at first, very stressful, especially because the first thing I was tasked with was trying to build on this momentum around reliability, and I'll get to that. But it was good fortune we happened to have a $100 billion surplus, right? Just to give you a sense, the annual budget for California is around $200 billion. So this is a big amount of extra money that came in this particular year. It only happens, well, it's never happened like that ever, but The last time we had a big surplus was 20 years ago, right? So this is a big opportunity. We were able to devote a lot of those resources towards reliability, and that was the big project that I worked on right away. Anyways, it's very difficult to keep up with this gentleman. He's awesome, and it was inspiring to work for him. So we're going to go back in time. I was trying to understand, well, what is the Energy Commission about? A lot of people think about the energy crisis. When you think about the energy crisis, what is the energy crisis when you hear that? Anybody?
OPEC in the 70s.
Okay, so OPEC in the 70s, right? I guess I said the early 70s here, so you're thinking about that. So that was the oil embargo, right, in 73, 74. We also were talking about building nuclear power plants every 20 miles up the coast. We had San Onofre, and we were going to build, in 1985, we actually did build Diablo Canyon. There's one up in Humboldt. There's one in Ventura County, much smaller. Rancho Seco, that was in SMUD. We built that one. We never used it, but we built it. It's really expensive. Almost bankrupted SMUD. SMUD could have gone over to PG&E service territory. That was pretty crazy. But this was the projection. And so the commission was built at a time when we were really thinking about how are we going to meet our growing energy needs. And so in 1974, Warren-Elquist Act created the Energy Commission, and really it was focused on energy efficiency, right? Because that's how we avoided having to build nuclear power plants all up and down the coast. It's big investment in energy efficiency. Again, that's kind of a homage to why we're here today, why our program exists. But also to kind of put together an accurate forecast of our electricity demand so that we could plan accordingly. And then support R&D. This is stuff that the Energy Commission still does today. And the policies that it's generally working on right now are these ones: carbon neutrality for the whole economy by 2045. That scoping is generally led by the Air Resources Board, but the Energy Commission is implementing that. SB 100 challenges the electricity sector in particular to get to 100% clean electricity retail sales by 2045. And then, of course, we're focused on our electric vehicles, and that's a big impact to the energy system. So today, those core functions of the Energy Commission have evolved. Ideating policy is one of the big ones, right? And in fact, that integrated energy policy report that comes out every year is an opportunity for us to come up with new policy solutions that are going to help us unlock those barriers that are preventing us from doing kind of the clean energy transition that we need. Investing in R&D, this is a lot of money that the Energy Commission spends on that. A lot of that funding does come to UC Davis to fund our research. Developing and deploying, so this is scaling a lot of these resources as well. Increasingly, we're spending money trying to leverage federal resources, right? Preparing for emergencies, this is something that, again, has been highlighted by my personal time there. It's been a real emphasis. But still, always energy efficiency, and I would include in that demand flexibility. We're going to then talk about that. Overseeing energy infrastructure, that's really important, especially with transmission. So we're in charge of, the Energy Commission is in charge of siting large thermal power plants, anything over 50 megawatts, as well as renewables and batteries. Now there's an opt-in opportunity for developers to have the Energy Commission be involved in permitting. And then working both with other states and around the world. Obviously, California is a leader, and if we're successful doing addressing our greenhouse gas emissions, that's great. But if nobody else in the world does what we're doing, then we're failing. So in many ways, we have to do a really good job of setting the right path. Okay, this kind of repeats what we just said. We've got these big climate policy goals, and the Energy Commission supporting that. And so when we think about this transition, this clean energy transition, it does have to be holistic, right? So we're, and a way of thinking about this is that we know where we are now, okay? And we kind of know where we want to be in 2045, right? We want to be carbon neutral. We want it to be mostly all electric, or and any fuels that we're using are clean molecules. And we're going to have to do some sort of carbon capture for the instances where we do use fossil-based fuels or carbon-based fuels. And we're going to have to start removing carbon from the existing kind of the emissions that we've already made. We have to start pulling that out of the atmosphere, right? So all of those things have to happen, and we're here. So we got point A and point B. It's just this path from point A to point B that's going to be really challenging, and it's going to be lumpy because we built the energy system we have today over the course of more than 100 years, and supply and demand were able to work out. It was still lumpy over that time frame, right? But we're trying to change it radically in such a short amount of time, 25 years, that this is going to be really challenging to make it an equitable transition, to address affordability, right? And to be able to build that much. And so another way to look at it is, historically and today, most of our energy comes from underground. We pull it from underground. And what we're trying to do is re-industrialize, rebuild the infrastructure that we're relying on for millions of years of that energy resource, and try to bring it above ground. And so a lot of people think this is going to be a completely clean, beautiful, pristine transition. It's not, because we are going to have to build a lot of resources, and that impacts habitat, it impacts the economy, it impacts our way of life. And then we want to do it really fast. So anyways, it's really challenging. And it's got to be a holistic approach. But one of the key strategies that Californians identified, it's not the only strategy, is electrification, right? And so this is important. I'm going to go back to electrification. It's important because we're moving our transportation to electrification. We're moving our buildings to all electric. And we have to have faith in that social good. Because if we don't, then this whole transition falls apart. So we talk about energy. We don't co-benefits. People talk about co-benefits, right? But our health is not a co-benefit, right? Like, people die when the power goes out. Okay. Fortunately, many of the people in this room are not in a situation where if the electricity goes out, you're not going to potentially lose your life. But that exists for many people in our society, right? And it's not just losing life, it's losing livelihoods, especially as we think about the transition. But if we lose power, it impacts the economy, it impacts jobs, it impacts our comfort, certainly. But this is why in 2000, this is the other energy crisis, right? When there was Enron and market manipulation, 2001, when we had system-wide blackouts, people were really upset, and there's price issues, so PG&E went bankrupt for that reason. The other utilities were also faced with high prices. Everybody was paying more. There was blackouts, and Governor Davis at the time got recalled, largely because of it. It's a political issue. And if it's a political issue and it impacts political will, then that really threatens the climate transition that we're all committed to working towards. So in 2020, we faced the next 20 years later, the next energy crisis, which was rolling blackouts. Now, fortunately, it wasn't as bad as it could have been, but we're going to talk about what we did in response to it. But the climate is changing, and we have not been planning our energy system accordingly. So this slide basically shows it. It'll show you that it gets wider as we go, right? Historically, the season, the heat wave season, was between May and September, right? And that's elongating. So by the end of the century, we're talking basically March through October. That's when we might have heat waves, right? And so this is changing. This is different. Let's see if this is not working anymore. I had another slide, but basically showing that heat waves last longer, right? The length of time of heat waves, 1 to 2 days. We're talking, again, by the end of the century, we might see heat waves that last an entire month. So this is kind of a real threat. Now, drought and wildfires also pose risk to reliability. In 2001, we had a big wildfire that knocked out a 6,000 megawatt transmission line coming from Oregon to California. Fortunately, we didn't have a heat wave at the time. It was in June. And fortunately, it didn't coincide with any other challenges that the grid was facing. But it started to make us realize that there's compounding risk here, right? And so, in order to address our net peak demand, what we've been using is gas, right? And so the green line is the gross peak, right? And then the purple is the needed amount relative to the solar and wind that come on. Now, the solar obviously drops off during the day, and this is a particularly problem in the shoulder season around September, the beginning of September. We'll come back to that. But basically, we're going to need kind of a ramping resource. And gas serves as that ramping resource right now. We obviously want to get off of the fossil gas because of the emissions and also the local air pollutants. If you want to look at when during the day and during the year we're using gas, it lines up. This is again, September, the first weekend of September, right? You're looking, that's when we're using gas pretty much all day, right? Especially right here. That's where we're using those resources. This is the real hot spot. Now, you can imagine in the winter when we start electrifying things, we might start to get peaks in the winter, but we're not seeing that right now. So this is the real challenge from a reliability standpoint, is that we are relying on these gas resources, these gas power plants, to kind of meet our ramping needs. And it's not enough. So in 2020, we were using all of our gas, and it wasn't enough. Now, in part because some of the gas actually wasn't performing as well as it could have. So some of those gas plants went offline. That was part of the problem, but it was within the range. So what did we do in response? Well, I mean, we had rolling blackouts, and then the governor did not want that. The policymakers, nobody wants that, right? People die, and it's politically bad for everything we want to do. And so I wasn't there, but this is in 2020. What people started doing were shedding load, right? So we're going to turn off people's power that they don't need to run it. And businesses don't like that, but they'll do it if they're told to. But it's not a good way to run a business. People don't like that. And then those people that have backup generators, we actually ask them to run them. Why do we do that? Have them run diesel generators. If they don't run them, then we're going to have rolling blackouts. And when we have rolling blackouts, those diesel backup generators will go on. So we're in this kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. And so running backup generators was and is one of the solutions. In fact, we've got 15 gigawatts of diesel backup generators in the state, distributed throughout the state. So if you think about it, we have this ramping problem. We need about 10 gigawatts. We've got 15 of backup generators, right? Why are we ramping with these gas? We could just use a diesel. Obviously, we don't want to use diesel, but this is a trade-off that we're facing, right? So in response to 2020, what we did is we realized, look, the climate is way worse than we're realizing, right, in terms of these heat waves that we're facing. We need to change our planning process. We need to procure more. And we need to coordinate better than we have been before. But we haven't been buying enough. So they started doing that in 2020. 2021, we saw the fire that cut out the transmission line. We're like, man, we need to start building even more than we thought. And we need to do it quickly. By the way, in 2000, all of there was these legacy once-through cooling plants. These are power plants that are near the coast that use seawater to cool the thermal plants. And they're large thermal plants that have been around for a while. They're in the close to 1,000 megawatts each, so there's probably about 3 gigs worth of these once-through cooling plants that had all been negotiated. They were going to retire at the end of 2000. Well, we had the blackouts of 2000. We're like, we don't want to retire these natural gas plants. So we extended the life through 2023, okay? Well, 2021 hits, we see the transmission fire. 2022 hits, we're looking, this is when I joined, February, and it's like, oh, great, we're building all this stuff. Oh, COVID, has caused all these supply chain issues. Battery prices are going through the roof because everybody's buying lithium. So battery storage projects are not getting built. There's this Department of Commerce investigation into Chinese tariffs, price dumping in solar PV modules. So all of a sudden, all of these planned, procured projects that involve solar, which doesn't really help with the ramping, but solar plus storage does, were under threat. Okay? At the same time, we're realizing we need to do a better job of planning and procuring, but we're not building either. We have an antiquated permitting system where it's hard to permit these things. It's very difficult to interconnect these things. And there's not enough labor to both do the upgrades to the system and also to plan for those additional new projects. So all these things are coming to a head, and so at that moment in time, we were able to invest in creating a strategic reliability reserve. And this is about $3.5 billion that we set aside, as we worked towards in spring. Later that fall, another $1 billion was added through SB 846, which looked at extending the lifetime of Diablo Canyon as well. So that's also considered a once-through cooling plant. And this is a nuclear power plant that had been negotiated to shut down in 2024, 2025. And we're seeing what's happening. We're like, we need this at least through 2030 to keep this resource on. Now, to give you an idea, it took 5 years to negotiate shutting down Diablo Canyon for 2024 and 2025. And within a matter of 6 months, we started the process of trying to unwind that agreement. That involved labor, local communities, the tribal nations that were involved, on their land, all of the different state water control board, the coastal commission, all of these different agencies have to kind of unwind this agreement. All because reliability. And so reliability is so critical. And I'm gonna do this way. I might just use mine. So this is why we needed a reliability reserve, right? And this is complicated, but there's a resource stack, a stack analysis that the Energy Commission does every year. It's a reliability kind of planning purposes. It says, look, this is the resources that we have to meet a traditional, what we call 1 in 10 loss of load expectation, which means 1 in every 10 years we'd have some sort of issue. Now there's contingencies above and beyond that should meet beyond that 1 in 10 because nobody wants it in 1 in 10, but this is a kind of a standard. But then we have to account for some of these delays in actually building this stuff out. So this is why it's called the great implementation. It's not about planning anymore. We're figuring that out. Now it's about how do we actually build it. But what about extreme heat situations, these climate situations? And what about if we happen to have all 3 of these things happen at the same time? A western heat wave that causes us to, man, I'm really behind. Anyways, we built a big reserve. It was really interesting kind of thinking through, the Department of Water Resources manages a number of these infrastructure assets where they would pay for these once-through cooling plants to continue to operate. They'd pay to help kind of maintain, for instance, Diablo Canyon to keep it running and get it re-permitted and go through that whole process. But also, they've built dedicated gas power plants, some of which can be transitioned to hydrogen-based, but these are brand new gas plants that will only run during emergencies. And if you look at the cost per megawatt of that capacity, $3.4 billion does not go very far. I mean, the best investment is maintaining those existing assets, right? Extending those existing, because they're already built, right? But to build something takes time and it takes a lot of money. And so it doesn't, so try to figure out what are some ways we can invest in clean resources, right? Non-fossil based resources that get us that ramping. And then there was another $1 billion that was added on after, as we were looking at extending Diablo Canyon, looking at also other ways that we could shift load and find clean resources that we could meet our needs with. So we're going to come back to the load shift goal at the very end. All this is going on while I'm trying to understand this relationship between the Energy Commission and these other entities. And so there's the California Public Utilities Commission, which oversees the IOUs, investor-owned utilities. They have their own commissioners, and they have their own staff, and they're a much older institution. CalISO is the youngest, but I like to think of the Energy Commission as a young agency because it was born the same year I was, 1975, so I like to think I'm young still. Okay, and then there's the Air Resources Board. All of them are working together, and the Energy Commission is trying to play this supporting role. I would say that through the process of 2020 and then the work that the Energy Commission continued to do through 2022, I think of it from a planning standpoint as measuring twice, cutting once. And so whereas maybe we are involved in the energy forecast, we are involved in the stack analysis, but making sure elevating those analyses in such a way that it can inform and make sure that we're doing the right planning and we're doing the right procurement is something that the Energy Commission has worked very, very hard at collaborating with these other agencies. And just to give you a sense, this is just reliability planning. You can see all the different ways that we collaborate across these different units. Again, this is like resource planning and how this is actually a chart I think that the CPUC puts out that describes how we do resource planning in the state. This is how do we identify how much resources to get, and it starts with the demand forecast, which the Energy Commission puts out, again showing what we expect our load to be, but it's engaging with both ARB on the scoping plan, the integrated resource plans that CPUC approves for all of the investor-owned utilities, managing the renewable portfolio standard for each of those. CPUC manages the IOUs, and we kind of oversee the POUs, the Energy Commission, interacting with CAISO. So it's a very complicated, this is where I would come away like, oh my gosh, I know nothing about how this works and trying to come up to speed. And historically, the planning process kind of was here. This is what it looked like before 2020 summer, and then after we started adding this extreme event planning. And so we're adding a whole new level of coordination and a new set of assets that we're investing in on how to address kind of reliability. All right. So lesson number 3, I zipped through that, I realize. That was lesson number 3. Lesson number 4 is that, yes, we need to focus on reliability. Yes, it's complicated and requires close collaboration. But we really need to build a lot of resources. And this is what I was talking about earlier, pulling the infrastructure we're talking about out of the ground and building it above ground. And so, effectively, we're like the amount of resources that we're building is staggering. And if you think about kind of the build rate that we have done with wind and solar, we have to triple the amount that we're building annually. And so from a job standpoint, right, from a labor, who's going to do that? But one of the challenges is how do you permit that much work? How do you interconnect it to the system? That's a choke point. How do you finance it, right? Given that we have limited dollars to do this. And then on the storage side, we need to basically build, right now our peak September 6th was 52 gigs. We're before 2020 we had like 250 megawatts of storage on the system. By 2023 we had close to 4,000 megawatts, without which we would have not have made it through the heat wave in September. We would have definitely had rolling blackouts. We're scheduled to build to 52,000 megawatts by 2045. So basically, we're going to build our entire peak load, what it was this past year, we have to build that much in batteries. Now, it's not all necessarily lithium, right? It could be long duration storage, but it's battery storage. And so just 8x what we've been doing. It's unbelievable, the scale that we're talking about. And then we talk about long-term resources, right? So transmission is probably one of the hardest things to build, and it's also very complex, and we need to build it quickly. It's interesting, some of these long-term resources, they have economic, these are strategic decisions that we have to make as California, right? If you think about offshore wind, and it was really interesting to see how big we're talking these turbines are. I mean, there is a slide in here somewhere, but I think I hit it. But it's like showing the size of these turbines and how big they are. They would not fit underneath the Golden Gate Bridge, right? You have to like sink them and then float them under, and then if you build them out there. I mean, there's going to be new technologies on how we build them out, but they're going to be very costly. It's going to be very challenging to build the transmission just for the offshore wind. But there are strategic reasons to potentially build it. First of all, offshore wind has a great capacity factor, and it's the load profile of offshore wind as compared to onshore is really favorable to our load needs, right? That ramping time. You could probably get similar load profile from wind all the way in Wyoming. Okay, so, and it maybe costs less if we commit to build that transmission, but then what about the economic development opportunities and the just transition as we transition away from the gas industry? This is a new industry that allows us to meet economic goals that we might have in California, and so this is a big play. This is like a $100 billion play, right? 25 gigawatts at least by 2045, and it may be that there's a upfront cost, and so building that out to 50 gigawatts might even be better. And then looking at kind of transmission, there's a 20-year transmission outlook that CAISO's put out recently, but it's figuring out how do we get those resources into constrained areas. So especially the LA basin is just a constrained, there's not enough room to build solar and wind there, so you have to pipe it in. You can pipe it in through molecules, whether it's hydrogen, currently it's fossil gas that we're transporting in, or do you somehow build transmission? And there's probably just not enough capability to even do that. But they are looking at doing transmission undersea into those ports as well, into those basins. All that said, equity is really foundational to this transition, right? If you think about, we've for decades, communities have been betrayed by the state and by the energy investments that we've made. And so this is one of the things that I really appreciated about Siva's leadership is that every year we're supposed to do this integrated energy policy report, and he worked very closely with the Public Advisor's Office, who's expanded to actually include tribal relations as part of their named kind of mission, to take the integrated energy policy planning process out into communities. And as part of that, we were able to do the meetings. Typically they're held in Sacramento or they're remote. Instead, we went to various communities and not only held the meetings there, but then did tours and met with community-based organizations and EJ leaders in those communities. So we visited 3 regions. One was in the Salton Sea, where we met with tribes to talk about kind of the impacts of kind of the Lithium Valley. And here we are. We're going to have to pull materials out of the ground in order to transition, right? And lithium is going to be an important play in that, geothermal energy as well, to meet our storage needs. Remember, we're doing 52 gigawatts of storage. So there's a strategic reason to invest, and there's trade-offs, right? There's economic development, but there's also tribal kind of connections to the land, and understanding those trade-offs and wading into those and leaning into those is something that Siva is passionate about doing as part of the Energy Commission, and leaning into those trade-offs. I think that was one of the takeaways from one of the initial workshops on thinking about equity, was this idea. It was Dr. Emmanuel Pastor, who's a professor from USC, who kind of framed things around, instead of talking about the environment or the energy system or the economy, reframing the way we talk about it to say it's our economy and it's our environment and it's our energy system, and recognizing that there will be challenges to coming to agreement, right? There's a lot of rhetoric that's thrown about, and the best thing to do is to lean into that and get around the table and get past the rhetoric, right? And acknowledge that there's going to be hard, lumpy, transitional challenges that we go through. And so leaning into that, so one was at the Salton Sea, another was in the Central Coast, and where they happen to have a once-through cooling plant right in the middle of their neighborhood, and it's, you know, not pretty to look at, and certainly disconcerting, both from noise, but certainly from emissions. And we toured it with local youth who are adamant about shutting it down. At the same time, we're advocating, not necessarily advocating, but we're the only solution that we can propose is to extend the lifetime of those once-through cooling plants. The trade-off is we'd have to run more backup diesel backup generators. So it's this awful choice, right? And so, but having to have that conversation, and having to kind of recognize that we have to talk about, okay, so if this is the case, if we're going to extend it for the next 3 years, what are we going to do to make sure that we don't have to extend it again, that we actually shut it down? And how do we make sure we're prioritizing shutting down plants in these most disadvantaged communities, the communities most burdened by the energy system? So, and the third one was in the Central Valley, was in Kern County, where actually Kern County has the most renewables of any county in the state. And they also have a pretty large oil and gas industry and labor force. And so we kind of met with their representatives and to talk about kind of the jobs that these folks have built their identities around, right? So it's not all simple, we're just going to do this. It really does kind of touch all these different aspects. And so again, this was something that for me was personally just an eye-opening experience to kind of both go in person to kind of hear and see this, but also just the willingness to sit at that table. And it doesn't necessarily result in kumbaya afterwards, right? Like, it doesn't mean that, you know, when Siva has to make that decision, the people that come and comment during the public comment period are not pulling punches, right? But he's willing to show up and willing to lean in and work towards, ultimately I think we'll get to point B, but it's really complicated on how we get there. And what we need is good leaders to get there. We need to build trust and work together towards getting it. One kind of big equity issue is this affordability one. And the Energy Commission we haven't worked as much on affordability. That's really the CPUC who's kind of at the forefront of that, and they're trying to manage these rate increases, and you're seeing kind of, and actually those rate increases are a threat to our objective of electrification. But it's not just electricity where the rates go up. It's natural, the fossil gas prices are shooting up, and certainly gasoline. And this kind of makes sense, right? We've told the oil and gas industry, hey, we want to switch to all electric, right? As fast as we can. So if you owned a refinery in California And every 5 years, or 5 to 7 years, you have to make another $5 to $7 billion investment to keep that refinery going. And the state is basically saying, we don't want you, we don't need you based on our policies and where we're headed. Kind of makes sense to maybe shut that down. And a lot of these refineries are switching to biofuels, in particular renewable diesel. So when they do that, they stop producing gasoline, and it turns out that California, because we have of where we are geographically, and because we have specific blends that we want for our gasoline, there's only a few refineries, they're all based in California, that serve our needs. So if there's a problem because one refinery has a shutdown, or when invariably these refineries shut down at certain times, it's not a perfect linear curve that follows. It's going to be very chunky. And so when that happens, we're going to potentially have price volatility. Again, point B, 25 years from now, this is not going to be an issue, but it matters today that in October of last year, the price of gasoline was close to $8 a gallon, right? And that's not, for many people in the state, that's not sustainable. So how do we address this? How do we address these affordability issues at the same time, right? And so one of the projects that Siva got put on was kind of this understanding, improving the amount of market analysis on petroleum markets, and in particular on oil refineries in California, and understanding their profit margins. Because during transitions like this, without transparency, there is a concern that there could be market manipulation or bad actors. And so it's really important hey, let's prevent that from happening so that we can reduce that price volatility as much as possible. All right, my last lesson, of course, is a little bit self-serving, but it's true. We're going to need both energy efficiency and load flexibility. And so remember what we talked about, how much resources we're going to have to build? If we get 20% savings in energy efficiency, 5% savings, we reduce the need for that new resource to be built. And that marginal cost of that resource is significant. So energy efficiency is really, that's been our secret sauce since the 70s. That's why we didn't build the nuclear power plants. That's why we've been able to kind of have flat growth in our electricity system for the past 20 years, until now we're like, oh my gosh, now we need to build, because we're doing all electric. Well, that wasn't the plan 20 years ago, but we invested heavily in energy efficiency. And so we need to continue to invest in energy efficiency, and we also need to invest heavily in load flexibility. I put this picture up here. This is my living room, and that's Siva, and he probably is operating on 2 hours sleep. That's Karen Douglas, who at the time was the energy advisor to the governor. She's now a commissioner at the CPUC. And all three of this is September 6th, and we had just gotten through the blackout, avoiding the rolling blackout. Okay, and the reason why they're at my house is because there happened to be in the city of Davis, we had a circuit overload that had nothing to do with it was a heat wave, but it had nothing to do with the broader potential rolling blackouts. So part of Davis's power went out. And so they didn't have power, so they came, and I was on a different circuit, so they came over, and we were still operating on, we didn't have any of the air conditioner on, everything was low light, very low, everything, electricity, but we were hanging out together, and we were literally like calling back and forth, like what megawatts can we shed, calling people last minute, like what can we do at this point? And it was an Amber text alert that many of you heard about, which went out, and this doesn't look as dramatic because it's scaled from 20,000 to 50,000 megawatts, right? But if we zoomed in, it would be a very dramatic drop where that arrow is, where there was a drop of about 2,000 megawatts, triggered by an alert that was sent out via the governor's office asking people to shed load. This is a last-ditch attempt, because if they didn't, we were going to engage in rolling blackouts. In fact, we did go to level 3, which means that CAISO started to arm its backup generators and started running them, and then was like calling the utilities, all right, get ready. And so there was a few utilities who actually said, oh my gosh, and they just started doing it, and they didn't need to. We didn't actually ask, they weren't asked to, but it was a confusion situation. So there's some that actually lost power, but for the most part, we avoided it through this Amber Alert. What this tells us, though, is that there was on the hottest day when everybody knew that this was an issue, there was 2,000 megawatts at least of demand flexibility in the system. That we could, now, this is in none of our planning, right? And I don't think we can ever include this in our planning because Amber Alerts are not something you want to count on, right, as a resource. But what it does tell us is that we can invest heavily in load flexibility. And in fact, part of SB 846, which kind of, again, was the Diablo Canyon, kind of looking at extending Diablo Canyon, and putting another $1 billion of work on clean energy resources, part of that legislation tasked the Energy Commission, this is one of the last things I got to work on, with establishing a load flexibility goal for the state, which had never been done. And we estimated that there's about 3,500 megawatts of existing load flexibility. And by the end of 2030, we want to get another 3,500 megawatts. So I'm using these numbers like 3,500 megawatts, right? And what does that mean? Diablo Canyon, right, is about 2,100 megawatts of baseload power, assuming it's operating. So we just did this whole thing to extend Diablo Canyon, but if we can count on load flexibility, we can avoid 2 of these nuclear power plants, almost 2. But this is when we can start using these investments to then prioritize shutting down once-through cooling plants, not just Diablo, but the other polluting gas ramping, fossil gas ramping solutions. But the flip side, I just want to make sure we all understand. The scoping plan that maps this out, it requires CCS. It requires carbon capture. We are going to need gas for a long time. So we better figure out how to capture the carbon. And we need to figure out how to remove carbon that's already exists in the atmosphere. So we're not going to solve everything with load flexibility, but it's our job, I think, from UC Davis's standpoint, to work on those issues. And that brings me to kind of my last kind of thinking about this, and the governor did put out a clean energy transition plan. It kind of maps out this challenge, I think, in a nice way, and it's really the calling, right? This is our calling. This is what it's really about implementation. We need to get to implementation. How do we implement this? And it's going to be hard because climate change is already really hard. We have to work on adaptation now at the same time as trying to solve this, right? And there's going to be trade-offs, and we need to lean into those. So I believe that UC Davis is really positioned to help the commission. Partly I feel bad leaving because I just have a lot of appreciation for what Siva does and what he's been doing, and quite honestly, it's not just him. I mean, it's the other commissioners and staff that I got to work with at the Energy Commission were all inspiring in their own ways. And the good news is that the Energy Commission is hiring, and I can encourage you to apply to work for them. In fact, that's one of the things that makes me sleep a little bit better coming back to UC Davis, is that I think that I can probably help more from UC Davis than I can as Chief of Staff for Siva, because he's so good. He probably doesn't really need my support directly, but if I can help train and mentor students that can become leaders and become part of the solution, whether it's at the Energy Commission or it's other agencies or it's industry or community-based organizations that can think holistically, right, and come and recognize the trade-offs that we're all facing and lean into solving them, right, and building trust, because at the end of the day, it's about people, And that's one of the things that Siva just exemplified, which was just building trust. He really reached across organizationally, both internal to government agencies, but also with external stakeholders to kind of lean in. So my hope is that we at UC Davis can help create those folks that can do that too. And then, of course, work on the technologies and the policies and the different best practices and mechanisms, right, that we need. And if I didn't make it clear, it's a really, this emphasis on energy efficiency and load flexibility is core to that. It's not the only thing. I think we need to figure out how to build, new supply. Those of you who've taken my winter class last year know that I'm interested in agrivoltaics. There's a conference on agrivoltaics next week, right? Which is thinking about how do you deploy the amount of utility scale solar we're talking about in a way that enhances agriculture, and we can put it on working lands as opposed to we don't want to disturb any existing lands, right? We're focused on 30 by 30, which is conserving 30% of the land in California by 2030. So this is, there's lots of work that we can do, and I'm excited. I talked to Kelly about his work on industrial decarbonization and the need for incorporating load flexibility into industrial operations. So it's both the technology and the policy, but it's also this willingness to be vulnerable and recognize that there is no perfect solution, right? And so perfection is often the enemy of the good. And so recognizing that not everybody's going to get what they want, but if that causes paralysis and we stay in the status quo, that is not acceptable, because we are in the year of implementation. We actually have to do this. So yeah, I'm really excited to be back, and I appreciate the opportunity that I had. I appreciate the connections that I made. I feel humbled, and I feel like I actually have more to learn. I'm looking forward to that. I'm really looking forward to working on Grand Challenges, which is trying to think about a holistic approach beyond mitigation, right? How do we adapt and make investments to adapt to this changing climate, and do it in a way that, again, addresses trade-offs. Again, hopefully it's win-win-win. We find those winning opportunities, that it's mitigation and adaptation, and fully leverages so many smart faculty, staff, students that are here at UC Davis. So I'm excited about that. Here's some pictures that are also kind of fun. Anyways, all right, well, that's my talk. Yeah.
So there are a few times in this talk I was like, so you mentioned about the backup generators. That's like a big chunk of diesel generators that are not good, but we have to rely on them.
Yeah.
You also talked about the demand side support, I guess, in that strategic reserve. I was wondering what that contains.
Yeah.
And then it's coming back to also is like the big storage need that we have. Do you see, or has there been any policies about installing storage on the demand side instead of on the utility side, where there are benefits, but the efficiencies and the usability of having demand side storage and policies and investments going into that? Has there been any talk about that, like putting batteries maybe in homes and in institutions, and like instead of putting those lithium in the utility side, can that lithium be on the demand side?
I'm trying to pull up a slide here that might answer your first question, which is speaking to like the bugs and the backup generators and relative to clean resources. So I'll do that while I'm trying to answer your second question. which is about distributed batteries versus centralized batteries. And I think the answer is yes, right? It's like we need it all. It's kind of the same thing with the solar, right? We want utility scale solar, but we also want distributed solar. Basically, any rooftop should have solar on it, and any working land or area that disturbed land that we can put solar, we're going to want to put it, right? And it's really helpful if it's in the load pockets, right? And so what you're talking about is, can we distribute some of those battery resources at the loads themselves? And there's all kinds of reasons why that makes sense. And so a lot of the distributed, there's a couple different programs. There's DSGS, demand side grid support, which is more, it pays operating costs for mostly bugs at this point, but it could be clean versions of backup generation, which could be fuel cells, hydrogen-based fuel cells, or other things that are low emission or zero emission. There's also the distributed electricity backup assets program, DEBA, and that's about $700 million. A large portion of that is designed to go towards distributed backup assets, which would likely be the storage components of any kind of microgrid, right? So solar doesn't really help address reliability. It's not a bad thing. It's just that's, if we have reliability money, I don't need new energy, I need power, right? And so if it's some sort of energy resource that provides dispatchable, then I'll take it. But otherwise, it's probably going to be on storage. So this is one of the big challenges with the utility, the kind of decision around rooftop solar, right? Is that it'd be really nice if people had rooftop solar plus storage, right? Because then they're actually adding to the peak. And this is kind of, it basically should be, it's for everybody, right? Is that going forward, we want all load to be good grid citizens. And by that I mean, you don't contribute to the problem, and if anything, you help, right? So if I decide, oh, I'm a new customer, I'm gonna build a house, build a business, build something, I want to connect into the grid, which is a social asset. If I'm like, yeah, I don't really care about when I use the energy, I just want to take energy when I want it, thanks. And then I only want to pay for, I want to pay as little as possible, and I'm going to use it at the worst times. It's like, no thanks. We don't want you to connect to the grid, right? It's not fair for you to be able to connect to the grid under those conditions. And so the expectation going forward is that we have to have good net citizens. I want to find this slide for you, but I can do that multitask if there's another question.
So that's like the NEM 3.0, that's push towards that, right?
That's in part why there was a push for that, yeah. I have this slide now, but I'm not connected, so I got to do that. Let me do that, because I just see myself. Okay, well, this is coming up. There we go. Yeah, so 2023, you looked at this. This is kind of largely emergency kind of load flex ability that we paid for. Actually, UC Davis helped provide load flexibility during 2023. I think we got like 9 megawatts out of them. So that was kind of fun. I was dialing for megawatts. We were dialing for megawatts. So 9 megawatts. Thank you, David. There he is in the background. That's awesome. So UC Davis definitely represented. UC Riverside also contributed, so we got to give them credit too. But yeah, DWR is the one, they run those dedicated gas plants that I mentioned, and then the bugs that were paid for under DSGS are here. That's kind of the rough kind of amounts, right, and proportions. And so we expect we're going to have more clean resources in 2024, 26, but we want to get out of the diesel backup generating business altogether, right? And okay, so this is another interesting thing, and I'm sorry we're diving into this particular question so much, but studies kind of show that people that have a battery, and this could be a business, it could be a customer, if I have a storage asset, I'm probably willing to let you, the grid, use 20% of it for grid services. You pay me a modest amount, I'll fluctuate during the day, but I still have 80% of my asset for me in case something goes wrong, right? And so we're figuring out how to create the right pricing signals to kind of unlock that. You could call it resource adequacy. You could call it day-to-day kind of energy services. Studies suggest, I don't know where these numbers actually came from. I don't have a source, but this is what my understanding is that there's probably another 30% that businesses and other entities load might be willing to offer during emergency situations, which, as we saw the climate, it's going to be more and more, right? We're going to have those situations. But so if I'm willing to pay you an obscene amount of money, you'll go down, maybe not obscene, but like a much higher amount in only a fewer instances, you'd be willing to give me that extra 30%. Because the threat is, hey, if not enough people put their hand in the pile, we're all going to go dark, which means now you're using 100% of your asset, right? And it's painful, right? And we're not going to pay you at that point. So there's a little bit of game theory, but so it's trying to figure out, is it exactly 30%? What is the percentage? And what is the mechanism? And what is the pricing? Right? This is all complicated, but it kind of makes sense as customers invest in some of these solutions. How do we have shared investment? And I think that's for residential as well as commercial. Is that helpful? Yeah. Yeah.
So, in thinking about all of the demand side resources and load flexibility in context of reliability and resource adequacy, it sounds as if all of these demand side resources, including load flexibility, are meant to be operational or relied upon when there are extreme events. Therefore, prices to use those will be very, very high, but is there also a push to integrate them in the day-to-day operation of the energy, of the electricity markets? At the end of the day, that's what they would be, or are they simply thought as extreme events turn these on, so they're going to have really, really low utilization, high impact, but very low utilization, so the value of those resources as a whole might be very low, right? We're just
capacity
we just put
factor.
1,000 batteries out there, and we're like, well, we used them for 1% of the hours. Well, poor use of resources. Should we be using these more frequently? And if that's the case, then how is CAISO then going to think about pulling in load flexibility, including batteries and others, EVs, heat pumps, whatever? Are they paying market prices? Is there going to be an entirely separate demand response market? And how is the CEC thinking about in long-term projections? If you're putting them in there, right, it's like, we need this for 2045. What's the market context for this? How is it actually operationalized? Because that's, I think, a big criticism of CAISO in other markets is it's a hey, pretty please, can you just stop using energy? Great, okay, thanks. And there's no actual payment for it. So the last year when we had the alert, that's 7,100 megawatts of capacity, or whatever the amount was.
Yeah,
it's what's the market value of that?
Yeah.
Like, how many millions of dollars is that could have been paid to those folks, right?
Yeah.
What are has the assessment been done to understand what the actual operating and market costs of these demand resources, if they're integrated in a way that actually truly uses them in a way that may be more beneficial than simply just that kind of a one-time, peaker or extreme event?
Yeah, we're delving into some of the challenging details right here, and this is where we've talked about maybe getting you a job over at the Energy Commission to work on this issue with Eric Lyon, who is probably he's really awesome. This is a classic kind of challenge. Like, do you invest all this money in an asset and you only use it 20 hours a year, 40 hours a year? It's real. Like, I'm sitting there like, well, okay, we could build a new gas power plant at 2 million a megawatt, and we only use it in its gas, or maybe we spend it on a fuel cell, hydrogen system that has zero emissions that could power both it could be used to, the hydrogen production could be used for maybe on-site forklifts of a commercial enterprise, and then also be used to, in the case of, can you find multiple use cases for these assets, right? But they cost a lot more, right? And so then, understanding capacity factors, and, at the end of the day, political leadership wants to know, are the lights going to stay on? You said that we weren't going to have a blackout, and then it's so I want something that I can turn on, that I control, that nobody else controls, that will go on in the case of emergency. There's something comforting about that, but it's costly to pay for it. And it's interesting, right? Because we're contorting ourselves to figure this out versus, is there some way we can just change our expectations? I'm just saying, we've talked about all different ideas, but that's one idea, is to change our expectation. Is there a way we can make sure that people who are at risk if the electricity goes out still has electricity using distributed storage solutions and distributed energy resources? But can we suffer through, candlelight or, or reduce services, right? And so anyways, that's one way to handle it. The other way is to invest heavily in nameplate stuff that only operates 40 hours a year, maybe 60, 80, 100 hours a year in the future. Or is there some way to make investments, especially in clean assets? If we invest in clean assets, we want those running as much as possible, because every time you're running a clean asset, you're replacing a dirtier asset. And so absolutely, it's kind of odd. We don't like these dirty assets, so we want to invest and make them clean. But if we put them in this clean market and we only operate them 20 hours a year, I'd rather actually still use, this is a weird scenario, but I'd rather, we have 15 gigs of diesel backup generators. Let's invest in load flexibility so we don't ever have to use them and use it in the market every day. And it's a really challenge. This is exactly the type of trade-offs that have real impacts on people who live next to the backup generator. They have a very different opinion about what makes sense for the system, right? And so I would say that our instincts around load flexibility are trying to get them even outside the CAISO market into the load modifying programs, pricing. If we can actually change people's behavior and get people to install batteries, and they use those batteries every day because it makes sense to them. This is The Economists, and I'm not Dave Rapson would like this, I'm sure. Oh, there he is. Yes, good. He would say, thank you. He would say, look, it's all about you wouldn't, this is oversimplification, but price signals really matter. If we can figure out how to do the price signal, it makes it way more efficient to use these resources. So there is a big effort around dynamic pricing. In fact, we're working on that research right now at UC Davis. We're partnering with Valley Clean Energy on their AgFit pilot program. I don't know if Mitch is listening, but Mitch will be happy to hear that. But looking at ways to leverage, not necessarily real-time pricing, because I think you had the speaker from Texas 2 weeks ago talking about the impacts of real-time, exposing customers to absolute real-time price, but dynamic pricing certainly, and then using that to kind of unlock load flexibility. And it's probably a combination of incentive programs that are less sporadic, less volatile, right? So you use different incentive programs to kind of blunt some of the volatility and some of the range of price impacts on customers. Long answer. I'm sure Dave's got some ideas on that too. But.
Ben, I have a question for you, actually.
Okay, shoot.
I apologize if I'm cutting anybody off in the room there.
I don't think you are.
I'm curious about cost containment and what discussions, if any, are going on at CEC about, as we move along this transition, and the uncertainties resolved, some of the states of the world there might be very high energy prices, right, for all the reasons that you just kind of discussed. And is there a sense that, in that state of the world, we might have to shift our expectations about the pace of the transition? Or, you've talked about equity considerations and affordability as main pillars, and I just wonder when those, might dominate with respect to, emissions reductions.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, Dave, and obviously so the CPUC does kind of oversee rates, right? And so that's more their purview, and of course they're looking at kind of this new rate structure, which would involve fixed charges, right? That would be potentially income adjusted, and that might send a clearer signal. But yeah, I mean, the generation costs are probably not that high, right? The energy costs are not that high. It's the capacity costs that are really high, right? That's where the problem is. Because the price for renewables is coming down. It's just it's capacity, and yeah, this is this question, right? It's it's a big trade-off question, which is we want electrification. If for instance, companies have put in orders for all of these large electric truck, heavy-duty trucks that are going to replace diesel trucks that are rolling through low-income communities, right? This, to me, feels like the biggest win, right? Maybe brake dust is a big issue as well, but like if you look at diesel emissions, how can we switch these out with electric vehicles, electric trucks, whether they're fuel cell or they're battery? Charging those trucks right now with all 100% carbon-free resources is not possible. So you have to decide: are you going to leverage the gas system and maybe continue to invest to leverage fossil gas in order to electrify, which generates local emissions and meets these. It keeps us going on this electrification targets, right? But it doesn't take away the need. Now that the need for that once-through cooling plant is actually still there, right? And because you need the power reliability. Because if I'm going to now run this truck all electric, I need the electric system to even be that much more reliable, right? So I'd love to say, oh, we can have it all. We can switch away from diesel backup generators. We can switch to electric trucks, and we can use all clean resources to do it. And we can do it it's not possible to do that, A, but B, to do that at a low cost is really difficult to do, right? And so I think that speaks to your question, that there are trade-offs associated with these decisions. And so it's almost like, do we want to slow down electrification so that we make sure that we decarbonize first? Or do we want to go all into electrification, recognizing we may have some emissions backlog in the next 10 years that we will slowly, well, not slowly, but we will catch up on, and to do it in a way that amortizes our investments to reduce the cost impacts for everybody, to everyone in the system. I don't know if that's helpful, Dave. Yeah. You, oh.
We are at 11:50, so
Oh, okay.
if anyone needs to leave, please do. But I think Ben will take another question or two for those who can stay.
I think you were next, and then you. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I appreciated what you had to share about equity and the transition, and so my question is related to that. Some of the least reliable circuits in California are in the northern region that serve a lot of tribes.
Yeah.
And then earlier this year in March, the commissioners of the CEC and CPUC met for that en banc, and there was this really incredible tribal energy resolution that came out of that. And I know Vice Chair Gunda was in attendance, and perhaps
Yeah, and well, this speaks to kind of an earlier question about distributed resources, right? And investing in distributed resources. But the tribesmen are certainly one of the communities that's been betrayed by the state and, historically, and by the energy system that we have. And so I think the Energy Commission and all of the state leaders are recognizing that. That was one small step, I think, that event. Fortunately, I wasn't there. But I know it was a meaningful one for Siva to participate in. Part of that was also an alignment around going after grant funding together. And there was a large proposal that went into the federal government. Unfortunately, my understanding is we didn't get it, which is devastating. It really is. And it's especially challenging because there is a unique opportunity to develop offshore wind as a resource. To do that requires, and I'm talking more generally now in that region, requires a serious investment in upgrading the infrastructure to be able to actually do that type of work. And so I think strategically the state is aligned on both trying to meaningfully engage and support tribal nations, especially in the North Coast, and then also invest in offshore winds. And so I think there's an alignment. But just as we talked about kind of like on the Lithium Valley, right? When we see, there are meaningful impacts to the ocean ecosystem and to the traditions and cultural kind of implications of such an investment, right? And transmission lines associated with it. So I don't have a good answer on, we were all hoping for us to we made this major investment, which unfortunately we didn't get. So I think we're going to double down. That's what I expect to happen. Got a great tribal engagement team. Katrina is I don't know if you know Katrina at the Energy Commission, but she's fantastic. And I think UC Davis is also well positioned to help in that regard. One of our grant challenges is around reimagining the land grant institution and really engaging in tribes, not just the ones locally here, but throughout the state. So, you had last question?
Yeah, that's kind of a good segue into my question. So, I was reading that actually there's big pushback from communities, wealthier communities in the Central Coast against deploying large-scale wind, offshore wind. And so I'm wondering, how much of a factor is NIMBYism a barrier to implementation? And then kind of at what point I guess somebody talks about this, but at what point does eminent domain kick in to kind of say, this is what we're doing?
Yeah, I think this is a challenge. Again, does the status quo deserve preference? It seems to always be the case, and this is a kind of just an observation in life, right? In my homeowners association, whether or not we, buy a new ping pong table, the old ping pong table is going to get the preference, right? That's trivializing this issue because it really is. It's a challenge to say, let's make this decision as opposed to let's just discuss and wait. And the challenge with this climate crisis is that waiting is actually a choice, right? And so, yeah, historically, waiting was, and in some cases, waiting is also has benefits, right? You don't want to make the wrong decision, but at this point, it's pretty clear we have to be making these investments. If we don't, we are continuing to rely on the resources that are underground, and we're going to. So, because we haven't shown an ability to change our behavior in terms of what our expectations are for services. So, yeah, I would frame it instead of NIMBYism as figuring out ways to get to yes. Right, and so it's recognizing there are trade-offs, but this is exactly what leaders have to do. Is bring people together and say, look, these are our options. not doing anything is not one of those options, right? And I don't think we've figured out how to do that yet. We figured out how to use rhetoric to kind of make our points. Unfortunately, we use rhetoric to vilify people that don't agree with us, and I don't know if that gets us where we need to get to. So it's about building trust, and it's about getting to yes, and it's about, so offshore wind, right? I mean, you saw this on the East Coast, and they could actually see it from where they are, so it seems like that's a little bit more in their face. This is 25 miles away, but yeah, sorry.
I was just saying, they're like this big.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Just to be clear,
They're
can
cute,
see it,
yeah.
But it's not like.
Yeah. That didn't really answer your question, man. That's a really hard one. Yeah, I can keep going, but I don't know.
Well, did you have one more question?
Oh, I just wanted to say that I worked for the interns of the CEC this summer with offshore wind, and I had to read all the comments about it. And there's a lot of people in like Big Sur area that are against it, but those are the loudest ones. There's actually a lot of people that are for it, and they're 20 miles offshore, so a lot of it's just through education. Again, like you're not going to see this; it's going to bring jobs in. So it's not all gloom and doom and NIMBYism. There are people that are supporting it, but yeah, the Big Sur people are definitely against it.
I mean, but unfortunately, the loudest ones are
Yeah,
the ones
it's
preventing
true.
things to go forward all the time, right?
Yeah.
Problem.
Supporters just have to get louder.
That's true, yeah.
In my backyard. Well, it is interesting. Denmark faced this same challenge. And actually, Siva was just telling me he was just in Denmark again, because I went with him the first time. But he went there and they were talking about this challenge. And one of the things that Denmark did is they said, look, let's create an app. And they started figuring out how all the resources they need to kind of make their energy needs met. And then they said, okay, we think we need to put these offshore wind installations and wind installations generally, who's willing to put it in their backyard?
Oh.
And people started volunteering, say, yeah, I would do it. And then they did basically kind of a competition where they would say, well, we'll pay you to put it in your, and then instead of it saying, we don't, like, it was almost like a competition of what I want it in my backyard, right? So I think there's lessons we can learn from Denmark, certainly, because they've certainly figured out wind. And also thinking about how you created community ownership and community equity, right, in those investments.
Let's give Ben a big